The sound came before the pain. A ripping noise, sharp, violent, Velcro tearing through silence like a scream nobody prepared for. In that moment, every head in the cabin snapped up, every breath caught halfway in, and time slowed just enough for everyone to realize something was terribly wrong. The plane was full, but it felt empty, too quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't calm you but warns you. Seatbelt lights glowed above every row, red and unblinking, like eyes that refused to look away. The engines hummed steadily, unaware, indifferent, as if nothing human could interrupt their rhythm. Then 2 uniformed airline security officers stepped into the aisle, their shadows stretching long across the carpet, and reached for the black man in seat 23 billions. They didn't ask again. Hands grabbed his arms, firm and practiced, like they had done this before. His glasses slipped off his face and hit the floor first, skidding under a seat where no one bothered to retrieve them. A second later, his dignity followed, pulled from him without ceremony, without permission. The man inhaled sharply, confusion flashing across his face before fear could even catch up. Passengers froze, bodies stiffened, spines pressed harder against seatbacks. Phones came out almost by instinct, screens lighting up like tiny stages as people began recording instead of intervening. Somewhere in the back of the plane, a child started to cry, the sound thin and scared, cutting through the heavy air. The man's fingers wrapped around the armrest with desperate strength, knuckles whitening as if that molded plastic was the last anchor keeping him connected to himself. His voice broke, not in rage, not in defiance, but in disbelief. Soft, cracked, human. "I paid for this seat." The words hung there, floating, waiting for someone, anyone, to respond. No one did. Not the officers, not the flight attendants, not the passengers who had heard him clearly. The silence answered for them. One officer pulled harder, the other braced. The man's grip slipped. His body lurched into the aisle, his shoulders slamming against an armrest with a dull thud that made several people flinch. Metal scraped skin. His head knocked against the edge of a seat. The sound sickening, final. A thin line of blood appeared at his temple, then smeared across the carpet as he was dragged forward, leaving a mark like a signature no one wanted to sign their name to. A woman near the aisle gasped, covering her mouth. A man too rose up, whispered, barely audible, "This isn't right." But his hands stayed in his lap. His feet stayed planted. Nobody stood up. The officers kept moving. The man tried to speak again, but his words tangled in his throat. Shock does that. It steals language first. His eyes darted around the cabin, searching faces, hoping to find one that looked back at him like he mattered. Some people looked away, others stared openly, curiosity mixing with discomfort. A few kept their phones steady, framing the moment as if it were content instead of cruelty. The pilot never turned around. The cockpit door stayed closed, sealed off from the reality unfolding just feet away. Up front, controls were checked, systems monitored, a flight prepared to depart on time. Whatever was happening behind that door did not register as a reason to stop. A flight attendant stood frozen near the front galley. Her posture was perfect, shoulders straight, hands clasped, jaw tight. She stared forward, eyes fixed on a point that didn't exist, trained not to see what was happening right beside her. Trained to follow procedure. Trained to survive the job by swallowing moments like this whole. The man's shoes scraped uselessly against the carpet as he was pulled closer to the exit. His breathing grew fast and shallow. Panic finally arrived, late but loud, pounding in his chest. He wasn't resisting anymore. That part of him had already been taken. Now he was just trying to understand how this was happening so quickly, so publicly, so completely. As they passed row after row, faces blurred together. Strangers, fellow travelers, people with tickets and destinations and reasons for being here. People who would land somewhere else and tell this story later, maybe with shock, maybe with guilt, maybe with excuses about fear and rules and not knowing what to do. Near the front, a passenger stood slightly out of the aisle, phone raised, recording everything. As the officers dragged him past, the man turned his head despite the pain, despite the hands gripping him, and locked eyes with the person filming. The look he gave wasn't angry, it wasn't pleading, it wasn't broken. It was steady. A look that said, "Remember this," a look that carried weight, as if he was handing off responsibility, saying, "If I can't speak right now, you will. If I can't stand, you will carry this moment forward." The camera lens trembled slightly, but it stayed focused. The exit door opened. Cold air rushed in, sharp and unforgiving. The man's body disappeared through it, dragged out of the frame, out of the cabin, out of sight. The door closed behind him with a heavy click that sounded too final, too neat for what had just happened. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then the plane exhaled. People shifted in their seats, adjusting clothes, clearing throats, returning phones to pockets. Someone laughed nervously, a short sound that died quickly. Another passenger shook their head, muttering something about delays. The child stopped crying. Life inside the cabin slowly tried to restart, as if this interruption could be folded away and ignored. They told themselves this was normal. They told themselves this was policy. They told themselves power always looks like this when it needs to. The engines continued to hum. Overhead bins stayed shut. The seatbelt sign remained on. Outside the windows, the airport lights blinked steadily, unconcerned. A voice eventually came over the intercom, calm and rehearsed, apologizing for the inconvenience, thanking everyone for their patience. No mention of a man, no acknowledgement of blood on the carpet, just out of view. Most people nodded along, grateful for the familiar comfort of routine. It was easier that way. But what none of them knew, what the airline didn't know as it prepared to taxi and take off, was that they hadn't just removed a passenger who didn't fit into their plan for the flight. They had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. They had turned a human being into a spectacle in front of witnesses who now carried proof in their pockets. They had ignited something they didn't understand, because silence only protects power when it stays intact. And this silence was already cracking. Somewhere beyond the gate, the man sat alone, disoriented, bleeding slightly, his glasses gone, his seat taken by someone else. But his presence lingered inside that cabin, heavier than before. Every passenger who avoided eye contact felt it. Every crew member who kept their posture felt it. Even the pilot, unaware, was flying with it. This wasn't just about a seat. It wasn't about rules or overbooking or schedules. It was about what happens when authority decides that efficiency matters more than dignity. When a black man's voice saying "I paid" is treated like noise instead of truth. The cameras kept recording long after the door closed. Messages were already being sent. Videos were already uploading. The world outside that plane was about to see what happened inside it, unfiltered, undeniable. And the airline that believed this moment would disappear at 30,000 feet had no idea what was waiting for them on the ground. The reckoning had already begun. The silence they relied on was no longer empty. It was full, and it was about to speak. The statement came fast. Too fast. As if it had already been waiting, polished and prepared, just needing a name to leave out. Within minutes of the incident, before the plane had even finished taxiing, the airline's official account posted the words that would try to bury what had just happened. An uncooperative passenger was removed for operational reasons. That was it. One sentence. Clean, calm, cold, the kind of language that sounds reasonable until you place it next to blood on a carpet. Corporate language has a way of draining the color out of reality. It smooths sharp edges. It erases faces. It turns pain into paperwork. In that sentence, the man lost his humanity again. He wasn't bleeding anymore. He wasn't scared anymore. He wasn't dragged anymore. He was just an uncooperative passenger. A problem solved. A disruption removed. End of story, they thought. But the story didn't end there. Because while the airline spoke in press releases, the world was speaking in videos. Raw, shaky, unfiltered. Clips ripped through social media like fire through dry grass. The first video showed his glasses on the floor, one lens turned upward like an eye that refused to close. Another clip zoomed in on his face as he was pulled down the aisle, the small cut on his lip catching the light. Someone slowed it down frame by frame, and in those frames people saw the exact moment his body went limp, not because he gave up, but because resistance no longer made sense. Millions watched, millions commented, some in anger, some in shock, some in shame. People paused the videos, replayed them, argued about what they saw, but they all saw something. A man being handled like cargo, a silence that felt louder than screams. The airline saw the numbers climbing and chose not to listen. They doubled down. Inside a glass boardroom high above the city, executives gathered around a long, polished table that reflected their suits back at them. Coffee cups steamed gently. Phones buzzed quietly. The view outside the windows was wide and beautiful, the kind that makes you feel untouchable. Calm voices filled the room, controlled, measured. They talked about policy, about overbooking, about procedures designed to keep flights on schedule and profits steady. No one said his name. They spoke as if the issue were abstract, like a math problem gone wrong. Someone mentioned optics. Someone else mentioned risk mitigation. Another suggested refunds, a public apology, maybe a travel voucher. They nodded, took notes, agreed that this would blow over. These things always did. On the ground, the man sat alone in a narrow airport hallway that smelled faintly of cleaning spray and stale air. His shirt was wrinkled from being pulled and dragged. His face was bruised, swelling slightly near the temple. A nurse knelt in front of him, holding out a small pack of ice wrapped in paper towels. Her voice was gentle, careful. "This will help with the swelling," she said. He looked at it for a moment, then shook his head slowly. Not out of pride, not out of anger. He just wasn't ready to feel anything yet. He wasn't in shock the way people expected. He wasn't crying, he wasn't shaking. He was thinking about how fast it happened, thinking about how many people watched, thinking about how small he felt when no one answered him. A reporter approached, microphone held low, cautious, unsure if this was the right moment. Cameras hovered at a respectful distance, red lights blinking. The question came softly. "How do you feel?" The man paused. A long pause, the kind that makes everyone lean in. He looked down at his hands, still trembling slightly, then back up. "Small," he said. One word. Honest. Heavy. Like I didn't matter. That clip went everywhere. Something about the way he said it broke through the noise. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rehearsed. It was plain and devastating. People who hadn't even watched the original videos stopped scrolling. Sponsors called the airline within hours. Advocacy groups issued statements. Legal analysts weighed in. Hashtags formed. Momentum built. Former employees began to speak. First anonymously, then more openly. Stories surfaced of similar incidents, brushed aside, quietly settled, never connected. Patterns emerged where there were supposed to be isolated events. The narrative the airline had tried to control started slipping through their fingers. The airline tried damage control. Press conferences followed. Executives stood behind podiums and read apologies written by lawyers. They said they were sorry for the experience, sorry for the inconvenience. They offered refunds, travel credits, promises of internal reviews, all the words that sound right but feel hollow. There was no accountability yet, no admission of wrongdoing, no acknowledgement of the imbalance of power that allowed this to happen in the first place. Just polished remorse without consequences. But something had shifted, and they felt it even if they didn't admit it, because the man they dragged away didn't do what they expected. He didn't rage online, he didn't shout into cameras, demanding revenge. He didn't disappear quietly with a settlement and a non-disclosure agreement, at least not yet. He waited. Waiting can be powerful. Waiting can scare systems that rely on quick reactions and faster forgetfulness. While the airline leaned on hierarchy and lawyers building walls of language and procedure, they underestimated one thing that history keeps trying to teach. A man with nothing left to lose is dangerous to systems built on silence. As night fell, the videos kept playing on loop. In homes and offices and dorm rooms, people watched and rewatched. Parents explained to their children why it hurt to see. Strangers argued in comment sections about rules and rights, but the image of that man being dragged stayed fixed, refusing to fade. The airline's stock dipped. Partners hesitated. Meetings multiplied. The boardroom view no longer felt as safe as it had that morning. Somewhere between the glass walls and the scrolling screens, the truth settled in, heavy and undeniable. This wasn't going away. The system had spoken, loudly, coldly, and in doing so it had exposed itself. The question now wasn't whether the airline would respond again. It was how far this silence could stretch before it snapped. The lawsuit did not arrive with noise. There were no angry interviews, no viral rants, no dramatic leaks meant to shame or shock. It arrived quietly, the way truth often does when it knows it doesn't need permission. A thick stack of documents filed with careful hands, precise language, and patience sharpened by pain. While the airline prepared for another round of public statements, this moved beneath the surface, steady and unstoppable. At first, the airline barely noticed. Lawsuits were part of the business. They had teams for that. Departments built to absorb impact, to delay, to settle, to outlast. Someone forwarded the notice to legal. Someone else marked it urgent but not alarming. Another crisis to manage. Another name to forget. But then the details started to surface. Buried deep in the filings, far from the headlines and hashtags, was the truth that cracked the foundation of the airline's story. The man they had described as an uncooperative passenger was not just a traveler who refused to give up his seat. He was not just another face in a crowded cabin. He was a physician, a researcher, a specialist whose work had quietly shaped the very systems the airline depended on to claim safety and responsibility. He had spent years studying emergency response, years building medical protocols used in transportation, years consulting on safety compliance models designed to protect lives at 30,000 feet. His work had saved companies millions. His recommendations had shaped training manuals. His name appeared in acknowledgments few passengers ever read, including theirs. Emails surfaced next. Old ones, polite, professional, thanking him for his expertise, praising his insight. Contracts followed, signed agreements, consulting fees, documents stamped with dates that made denial impossible. Executive signatures sat at the bottom of pages, ink dry, proof undeniable. In quiet offices, lawyers read through the material and stopped speaking. The boardroom that once buzzed with calm confidence fell silent as legal counsel finished laying out the facts. No one reached for their coffee, no one checked their phone. The glass walls reflected faces that suddenly looked less sure, less untouchable. "This doesn't go away," the lawyer said, voice steady, flat with certainty. "This goes public. And permanent." The words landed heavy. Stock prices dipped within hours, not dramatically at first, just enough to be noticed. Analysts raised eyebrows. Partners paused negotiations. Sponsors delayed commitments. Government agencies began asking questions that couldn't be answered with apologies or travel vouchers. How could a company claim safety while treating one of its own safety architects like a threat? The airline's internal narrative collapsed under its own weight. Procedures no longer sounded neutral. Policies no longer felt clean. Every defense they had built now pointed back at them, exposing how deeply they had misunderstood who they were dealing with. While executives scrambled, the man remained quiet. He watched as headlines shifted tone, watched as commentators corrected themselves, watched as the words passenger gave way to physician, then expert, then consultant. Each correction peeled away another layer of the lie that had protected the airline. For the first time since the plane door closed behind him, he felt the balance begin to move. When he finally spoke again, it was not from a hallway or a hospital bed. It was from behind a podium at a press conference. Lights warm on his face, cameras steady, questions waiting. He stood straight, shoulders squared. His injuries had healed enough to be invisible, but the memory had not faded. He did not smile. He did not glare. He spoke calmly. "I didn't ask to be special," he said, voice even, unshaken. "I asked to be human." The room went quiet. There was no bitterness in his tone, no desire to punish, just clarity, just truth laid bare without decoration. He spoke about dignity, about how easily systems forget the people inside them, about how expertise does not protect you when bias decides you are a problem instead of a person. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The airline CEO watched from a screen in a private office, hands clasped tightly, realizing something too late. The power had shifted, and it hadn't shifted because of anger or force. It hadn't shifted because of public pressure alone. It had shifted because the truth was undeniable. The silence that once protected the airline now worked against it. Every unanswered question grew louder. Every delayed response felt heavier. Every attempt to control the story only amplified the one they tried to erase. Employees watched. Customers watched. Regulators watched. The world listened in a way it hadn't before, not because the story was shocking, but because it was clear. A man had been treated as disposable, and the system that allowed it was being exposed piece by piece. Behind closed doors, meetings stretched late into the night. Strategies were rewritten. Damage control became survival. Executives spoke in lower voices now, their certainty replaced with caution. The glass boardroom no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a spotlight. Outside, people talked about dignity, about respect, about how often power mistakes compliance for consent. The man's calm words echoed far beyond the press conference, replayed on screens and in conversations, carried by people who saw themselves in him. He had not demanded justice with his fists. He had waited, and in waiting he had forced the truth to surface on its own terms. The airline learned, too late, that some men do not need to shout to be heard. Some do not need to fight to win. Some simply refuse to disappear. And once the truth steps into the light, no system built on silence can survive unchanged. The reckoning was no longer coming. It was already here. The settlement landed quietly. but its weight was impossible to miss. Numbers were signed, papers stamped. Lawyers nodded without smiling. It was historic in scale, but history is never just about money. It's about what the money admits. Behind closed doors, the airline agreed to more than compensation. They agreed to change. Policies were rewritten, mandatory reforms locked into place. Executives stepped down, not with speeches, but with resignation letters that said more than any apology ever could. Training programs were rebuilt from the ground up, not around control, not around force, but around empathy. Around remembering that people are not obstacles. They are lives passing briefly through a system that often forgets them. The airline apologized publicly again, but this time it was different. This time they said his name. They acknowledged the harm without hiding behind language. Cameras captured the moment, but even then, something felt restrained, almost humbled. The apology didn't erase what happened. It couldn't, but it marked the first time the company spoke like it understood why the world had been watching. Still, the real transformation didn't happen in a courtroom or a press conference. It didn't happen in stock charts or headlines. It happened months later, in a place that once held his worst memory. An airport. The lights were just as bright, the floors just as polished, announcements echoed overhead in the same neutral tone. But when the man walked through the terminal this time, something was different. He stood taller, head high, steps steady, no cameras chased him, no microphones waited, just people. Some recognized him, some didn't, some slowed their pace as he passed, eyes lingering a moment longer than usual, memories flickering behind their gaze. He didn't rush, he didn't hesitate. He checked in calmly, cleared security without incident. The line moved as lines always do, indifferent and slow. He waited his turn, shoes on, belt fastened, dignity intact. No one pulled him aside, no one raised their voice, no one treated him like a problem to be solved. At the gate, he sat quietly, hands folded, eyes forward. He watched other passengers laugh, scroll, argue softly, live their ordinary lives. He felt the hum of travel, the restless energy of people moving from one place to another, unaware of how fragile comfort can be until it's taken. When boarding began, he stood with everyone else. No special treatment, no spotlight, just another passenger holding a boarding pass, stepping forward when his group was called. He walked down the jet bridge without fear. Inside the plane, the aisle seemed narrower than he remembered, but he moved through it with purpose. He found his seat, sat down, buckled his seatbelt. The click sounded louder than it should have, sharp and final, like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. No one touched him. The doors closed. The engines started. The plane prepared for takeoff. And for the first time since that night, he allowed himself to breathe fully, deeply, without bracing for impact. Later, in an interview that aired quietly on a Sunday morning, the airline's CEO spoke words that would have sounded impossible months earlier. "We forgot we were dealing with people," he admitted, eyes lowered for a moment before returning to the camera. Not problems. That confession mattered. It mattered because it was simple, because it named the failure without excuses, because it acknowledged what systems often deny, that authority can blind itself into cruelty when it stops seeing faces and starts seeing disruptions. This was never just about a flight. It was about what happens when power assumes silence means agreement, when systems mistake compliance for consent, when dignity is treated as optional, granted only to those who make themselves small enough not to be noticed. The man never sought revenge. He never demanded heads roll. He never tried to humiliate the people who humiliated him. What he wanted was recognition, to be seen, to be heard, to have his humanity acknowledged in a place that had tried to erase it, and in the end he proved something timeless. You can strip a person of comfort. You can strip them of safety. You can strip them of respect in front of a watching world. You can drag them down aisles and speak about them as if they are less than human. But when someone refuses to surrender their humanity, when they hold on to dignity even when everything else is taken, even giants stumble trying to ignore it, power does not fall because it is challenged loudly. It falls when it is exposed quietly. So never measure a person by how quiet they are in the face of injustice. Silence is not always weakness. Sometimes it is restraint. Sometimes it is patience. Sometimes it is preparation. And when that silence finally speaks, the world listens.